I still remember the exact sound my chair made when I pushed it back from the table, that horrible scrape against the hardwood that made 30 people go silent all at once. My hands were shaking. My face was hot, and my father was still standing at the head of the table, his glass raised like he hadn't just said what he said, like he hadn't just called me the one thing I'd spent my whole life trying to prove I wasn't. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Faye. I'm 28 years old and I'm a chef. Not a restaurant manager, not a catering director, not any of the things my family spent years pushing me toward. A chef, the kind who wakes up at 5 in the morning, thinking about sauce ratios, who spends her days off at the farmer's market touching every tomato before buying anything, who once cried in her car after a perfect risotto because it came out exactly the way she'd imagined it for 3 weeks. That kind of chef. My family runs a chain of event catering companies across the mid-Atlantic. My grandfather started it in the 80s with a single van and a reputation for good brisket. By the time I was born, it was a real operation. Whitmore Family Catering, 3 commercial kitchens, contracts with wedding venues from Baltimore to Richmond. My father grew it further. My older brother joined the business at 22 and never looked back. My mother handles accounts. Even my aunt manages client relations from her home in Delaware. It's a family business in every sense of the word. Everyone pulls in the same direction. Except me. I didn't hate the business. That's the thing people always get wrong when I tell this story. I didn't grow up resenting it, or wishing I'd been born into a different family. I grew up in those kitchens. I loved them, actually. The noise, the heat, the way everything moved fast and purposeful. But somewhere around age 14, I started to understand the difference between cooking for 200 strangers at a corporate event and cooking something that actually meant something. I started watching cooking videos, not for fun, but to study them. I started experimenting at home, staying up past midnight trying to get a bechamel right, failing, trying again. My grandmother noticed before anyone else did. She'd lean over my shoulder and taste whatever I was working on and say, "Faye, you've got something." I didn't know what that meant yet. I just knew I wanted more of that feeling. By high school, I was sure I wanted to cook, not cater. I wanted to be in a real kitchen, developing menus, learning technique, building something with my own hands. I applied to culinary school without telling my parents. Got in. Then I told them at dinner, thinking they'd be proud. My father set down his fork. My mother looked at the table. My brother laughed a little, like I'd said something naive. "We have a perfectly good business," my father said, his voice calm in the way that means he's already decided the conversation is over. "You don't need culinary school for that." I tried to explain. Culinary school wasn't about the catering company. It was about learning to be a real chef, working in fine dining, building a career on my own terms. He heard it as rejection. Maybe it was, a little. But not of him. Of the path he'd already mapped out for me without asking if I wanted to walk it. I went anyway, took out loans, worked nights at a restaurant near campus to cover living expenses, called my grandmother on the hard days. She never told me I was wrong. She'd say, "Keep going. I see what you're building." Those calls carried me through more bad weeks than I can count. The years after culinary school were hard. The way that period of your life is always hard. Scrambling, learning, making mistakes that cost you sleep. I worked the line at a small French bistro in DC for 2 years. Then a farm-to-table spot in Charlottesville where I started developing my own voice. By 26, I'd become the sous chef at a restaurant called Hearth and Grain, a mid-sized place in Bethesda that actually had a following. My name was on a few dishes. Food bloggers mentioned us. A local magazine ran a short piece about the kitchen team and my photo was in it. I sent it to my grandmother. She framed it. I did not send it to my father. Family dinners during those years had a pattern I got used to. The way you get used to a bad knee that aches in the cold. My brother would talk about new contracts, my parents would beam, and somewhere around the second course, someone would make a comment. Casual, almost offhand, that landed like something thrown. "Still doing the cooking thing?" My aunt would say, the word thing, doing all the work. Or my father would mention a new venue they'd signed and then pause and look at me and say, there's still a spot for you in operations. Every time. Like an offer he was sure I'd eventually accept because I hadn't had the good sense to yet. I'd smile. Change the subject. Eat my food. Drive home and sit in my parking garage for 10 minutes before going inside. My saving grace at those dinners was my grandmother, Grammy, we called her, which she claimed to hate but obviously loved. She'd sit next to me whenever she could, and when my father started in, she'd redirect. "Tell me about that new dish you're working on," she'd say loud enough for the table to hear. It annoyed my father. I could tell by the way he'd pick up his glass and take a longer sip than necessary. But Grammy didn't care, and I loved her fiercely for it. My roommate at the time was a woman I'd met in culinary school. Sharp, funny, the kind of person who could make you feel better about a terrible day just by her reaction to it. She had left the restaurant world to do recipe development for a food startup, and she was the one who first said to me, "You need to start thinking about your own place." We were eating takeout on the couch after a long Saturday shift, and I laughed it off. But she said it again. "Seriously, you have the palate. You have the instincts. What are you waiting for?" I started saving. Not aggressively, not yet. I didn't even know what the dream looked like exactly. But I opened a separate account and started putting money in it. A small restaurant, maybe. Or a pop-up first. Something mine. Then Grammy got sick. Nothing dramatic, nothing sudden. A slow kind of tired that the doctors gave a name to and a treatment plan. She pulled through the worst of it, but the experience rearranged things. It made my family close ranks in that particular way families do when they're scared, which in our case meant pulling together around the business like it was something to protect. My father started talking more about legacy. My brother started mentioning that the company needed more people. Good people. Family. My mother would look at me sometimes at dinner with an expression I couldn't quite read. Somewhere between hoping I'd volunteer and knowing I wouldn't. Grammy, from her recovery, never once suggested I give up my path. If anything, she got more direct. "Don't let them guilt you into it," she told me on the phone one evening, her voice still a little thin from the hospital. "I know your father. He thinks love means everyone going the same direction. It doesn't." My father's 60th birthday party was supposed to be a celebration. My mother had been planning it for months, a Saturday night dinner at a private room at a restaurant in Annapolis. 40 guests, a set menu. The whole family would be there. Extended cousins, old family friends, business partners. It was the kind of event that felt designed to remind everyone how well things had gone, how much had been built. I went because he was my father, and it was his birthday. And I loved him. Even if loving him had always been complicated. I wore a blue dress. I helped carry in the cake my mother had ordered from a bakery we'd used for years. I smiled at people I hadn't seen since the last big gathering and answered the usual questions. I was doing fine. Yes. Still in Bethesda. Yes. Still cooking. Huh. Yes, I know. Still not married. Dinner was going smoothly enough. My brother gave a toast early in the evening, warm, funny. Exactly what you'd expect from someone who's always known his place in the story. Then a family friend stood up to say a few words. Then my father's business partner. Then my father himself. He stood slowly, the way he does when he wants the room's attention before he said anything. He thanked people. He talked about his parents, about building the company, about what it meant to have family around him. His voice had that particular weight it gets when he feels the moment. I watched him and felt, genuinely, some version of pride. This was my father, and he built something real. Then he looked at me. "Of course," he said. "Not everyone at this table has chosen to be part of what we've built." A small laugh from somewhere. Some of us decided early on that we had better things to do. The room shifted. Not dramatically, not the way it does in movies, just a subtle recalibration. People glancing sideways, glasses pausing halfway to lips. "I've always hoped," my father continued, his voice still carrying that careful control, "that my daughter would find her way back. But I've come to accept." And here he paused. and I felt something cold move through me. That she's chosen a different legacy, one that has nothing to do with this family. Silence. He raised his glass. To the family that stayed. I felt the words hit somewhere below my sternum. Around me, people were lifting their glasses, some uncertain, some not meeting my eyes. My brother looked at his plate. My aunt, his sister, actually raised her glass. My mother's hand was flat on the tablecloth and she was looking straight ahead. I sat very still for exactly 3 seconds. Then I pushed my chair back. The scrape. Those 30 people going quiet. I stood up, and I looked at my father, not with anger, not the hot, wild kind I'd felt so many times before, but something steadier and sadder and more final. I said, clearly enough for the table to hear, I didn't leave the family. I just didn't leave myself. I picked up my purse. Happy birthday, Dad. And I walked out. The drive home was strange. I wasn't crying, which surprised me. I kept expecting to, kept waiting for the wave, but it didn't come. What I felt instead was something close to clarity, the kind that arrives after a long confusion finally settles. I had spent years soft-pedaling my choices around my family, shrinking the size of what I wanted so it would fit more comfortably in the room with them. And my father had just stood up at his own birthday party and essentially told 40 people I wasn't really his. Something in me decided, quietly and permanently, that I was done making myself smaller. My roommate was awake when I got home. She took one look at my face and poured us both a glass of wine without asking. I told her everything. She listened. At the end, she said, "Okay, so when are we starting the pop-up?" We launched it 6 weeks later. It was absurdly small at first. A 12-seat dinner series out of a rented commercial kitchen in Silver Spring. Every other Saturday, a fixed 4-course menu that I changed each time. I called it Field Kitchen. No website at first, just an Instagram and word of mouth. We sold out the first dinner in 11 hours. Then the second. By the fourth one, there was a wait list. I was doing almost everything myself. Cooking, prep, sourcing ingredients, responding to DMs at midnight. My roommate handled the social media with a natural ease that I still don't fully understand. We had one part-time helper in the kitchen, a culinary student named Theo who worked for experience and free staff meals and turned out to be one of the most quietly talented prep cooks I've ever worked with. I paid myself almost nothing those first months. It didn't matter. For the first time in my career, I was making decisions about every dish, every ingredient, every experience. And it felt like breathing after holding my breath for years. Grammy found out about Field Kitchen through my cousin who'd seen it on Instagram. She called me immediately. "Why didn't you tell me?" She sounded more delighted than offended. I told her I hadn't wanted to make a big deal of it. "Faye," she said, "this is a big deal." She asked me to describe every dish on the current menu, which I did, and she listened like I was reading her something important. My family was mostly quiet. My mother texted me 2 weeks after the birthday dinner. Just checking in, she said, hoped I was well. I replied politely and briefly. My brother sent me a meme about chefs a month later, which felt like his version of an olive branch, so I liked it. My father said nothing. Neither did I. We existed in a silence that felt different from the old silences. Less like waiting, more like something completed. A local food writer came to Field Kitchen for the 7th dinner, on her own, without reaching out first. She posted about it, not a full review, just a casual "this is something you should know about" with a few photos. Reservations tripled overnight, her following was significant, and the response made something clear that I'd been trying not to count on. People were actually responding to what I was cooking. Not because it was trendy or strategically positioned or backed by a name. Because it was honest. The following months were the hardest and the best simultaneously. I was exhausted in a way that felt clean. The exhaustion of building something, not of managing something you never chose. I started talking to a small business advisor about what scaling could look like. A food hall in DC reached out about a permanent stall. A catering company, not my family's, contacted me about a collaboration for private events. I said yes to the food hall. I said I'd think about the catering. Through it all, Grammy was my steadiest correspondent. We talked every week, sometimes twice. She'd ask about the new menu, about what was selling, about what I was learning. She told me once, a few months in, "You know your grandfather would have loved this. He didn't start with a business plan either. He just started." I held on to that. The harder thing was the lingering weight of what my father had said, not the anger of it that had faded faster than I expected. What stayed was the grief of it. The realization that he had looked at my life and seen absence instead of presence, subtraction instead of something being built. I'd wanted him to see it. I'd wanted that for a long time. At some point, I had to make peace with the fact that I couldn't make him look differently. My grandmother's health had stabilized by then, and she started coming to field kitchen dinners when she could. She'd sit at the end of the table in her good coat and she'd eat everything, and she'd tell the strangers next to her that her granddaughter made it. Theo started saving her a seat without being asked. The food hall opened in early spring. A small space, 8 seats at a counter, a rotating seasonal menu, lunch and dinner 4 days a week. I called it Field Kitchen, same as the pop-up. The opening week was chaotic in every good way. Lines out the door, which I hadn't expected and wasn't prepared for, which meant everything took longer, and my face hurt from smiling while simultaneously problem-solving at full speed. Theo worked the counter with a calm I was genuinely grateful for. My roommate came every day that week just to help run things, taking no payment and refusing to discuss it. The review came out in a regional food magazine 2 months after opening. It called the food quietly extraordinary, and the experience the rare kind that makes you feel like someone cooked specifically for you. I read it 3 times in my car. Then I framed it and put it above the prep station. I heard through my cousin, the same one who'd told Grammy about the Instagram, that my father had seen the review. He didn't say anything directly, but my cousin mentioned that he'd been quiet about it, which from my father is a kind of language. My brother sent a real text this time. "Congrats, Faye." Seriously. I replied, "Thank you. Means a lot." And I meant it. My mother called the following week. It was the first real conversation we'd had since the birthday party. She didn't apologize for that night, not directly, but she said, "I should have said something when he gave that toast." Her voice was careful and a little tired. I knew it wasn't right. I told her I appreciated that. We talked for almost an hour. About the restaurant, about Grammy, about things that had nothing to do with any of it. When we hung up, I sat with the feeling for a while. Not resolution exactly, but something loosening. My father sent an email 3 months after the food hall opened. Formal, a little stiff, the way he writes when he's unsure of himself but doesn't want to show it. He said he'd heard good things about what I was doing. He said he hoped I was well. He said, near the end, that he thought I had built something worth being proud of. I read it 4 times. I didn't respond right away. I waited 2 days, then wrote back, "Thank you. I hope you're well too. I'd like to have dinner sometime if you're open to it." He wrote back the same afternoon, said yes. We haven't had that dinner yet. I'm not in a hurry, and I don't think he is either. There's something different in the waiting now. It doesn't feel like dread or obligation. It feels like something that will happen when it's ready to happen, between 2 people who've both had to adjust their picture of what the other person is. I think about that birthday party differently now than I did in the weeks right after. I used to replay it with anger at the center. Now what I feel is something closer to gratitude. Not for what he said, but for what it made clear. I'd been waiting for his approval without fully admitting that's what I was doing. Waiting to feel like my choices were real until someone in my family confirmed them. That night took the waiting away. Not gently, not in the way I would have chosen, but completely. Grammy came to the food hall for the first time last month. She sat at the counter in her good coat, and she ate the mushroom toast and the roasted beet salad and the lamb with preserved lemon, and she was quiet in a way that meant she was actually tasting everything. When she was done, she folded her napkin the way she always does and looked up at me and said, "This is it, Faye. This is exactly it." I had to go back to the kitchen for a minute after that. Theo pretended not to notice. Field Kitchen is mine. Every dish on the menu, every sourcing decision, every late night recalibrating a recipe until it's right, mine. Not a family name, not a legacy handed down, not something I inherited or fell into. Something I chose and kept choosing. Through every dinner where I sat smaller than I was, and every silence and every moment I almost let their picture of me become mine. I didn't leave my family. I just refused to leave myself. And it turned out that was enough. There's a moment I keep coming back to. Not the scrape of the chair, not my father's voice going quiet after I walked out, but the drive home. The part where I expected to fall apart and didn't. I kept waiting for the tears, the spiral, the familiar weight of having disappointed him again. Instead, there was just this strange stillness, like something that had been held at an odd angle for a long time had finally been set down straight. I think about what my father built and I genuinely respect it. Starting a business from nothing, sustaining it across decades, keeping a family employed and connected through it. That takes something real. It takes a kind of moral seriousness, a commitment to people who depend on you, that I don't dismiss. What I had to learn, slowly and not always gracefully, was that I could honor what he built without being obligated to build the same thing. Those two truths had to coexist in me before I could stop flinching every time I sat down at his table. Grammy understood this before I did. She used to say that the people who love you most are sometimes the ones least equipped to see you clearly, because they're seeing you through everything they hoped for and feared, all at once. I didn't fully believe her until I was 28 and standing in a parking garage at 11 at night, realizing that my father had just publicly declared me absent from his story, and that the thing I felt most wasn't hurt. It was readiness. What carried me through wasn't anger, even when anger would have been justified. It was something quieter. The ability to look honestly at what I was building and trust what I saw. Not arrogance, just the willingness to keep asking myself whether my choices were true, and to answer honestly even when the answer was inconvenient. That kind of honest self-reckoning is hard to sustain when everyone around you has a different verdict on your life. You have to develop a certain intelligence about your own instincts, learning which doubts are useful and which ones are borrowed from people who never intended to walk your path anyway. And then there's the part that doesn't get talked about enough, the showing up, over and over, when the outcome isn't guaranteed. Every pop-up dinner I cooked for 12 people in a rented kitchen. Every night Theo and I broke down the station at midnight and I drove home running the next menu in my head. Every time a reservation didn't fill and I had to decide whether that meant I was wrong or just early. That persistence, the unglamorous, unwitnessed kind, is what actually built Field Kitchen. Not the review. Not the food hall opening. Not my father's eventual email. Those were outcomes. The building happened in all the ordinary moments before them. What I know now is that the people who doubt you are not always wrong about you from malice. My father wasn't trying to erase me. He was trying to hold on to something. And I was the part that kept slipping out of his hands. Understanding that didn't make the birthday toast hurt less in the moment. But it made the afterward livable. It made it possible to write him back and mean it. Grammy sat at my counter last month in her good coat and told me I'd built exactly the right thing. I had to go stand in the back for a minute because I didn't want to cry in front of the customers. Theo pretended not to notice, which is its own kind of kindness. I didn't stop being my father's daughter when I walked out of that party. I just stopped waiting for his permission to be mine.